So, the belief in the resurrection of the body is undoubtedly the central theme in the Christian creed, but also the most recalcitrant to all attempts to incorporate it into a philosophical speculation. When St. Paul gave his discourse on the Areopagus in Athens, he could raise interest of the skeptical philosophers as long as he was preaching about the unknown God and the creator of the universe. But, I quote, when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, whereas others said, we will hear you again on that matter. From the beginning, the Christians were ridiculed by the philosophers for adhering to such absurd dogmas, and they had to defend their faith in many and diverse treatises, De Resurrectione, on resurrection. In those apologetic writings, they used arguments and concepts borrowed from philosophers, such as the Aristotelian distinction of matter and form, or the Stoic view of the eternal return of the cosmos, whereby all things will rise again. If one were to do a sociological inquiry among Christians today, one would find how uneasy most Christians now feel about the essential doctrine of their creed. Most believe that our earthly body is irrevocably destroyed after death, and they take the doctrine of the resurrection symbolically as an expression of the belief in immortality of the human person, whatever that may be. Patristic and medieval authors would have been outraged by such a widespread heresy. Their main concern was to understand how this earthly body, with its distinctive individual features, could by God's omnipotence be raised again from its destruction and reconstituted so as to remain incorruptible. Of course, they all admitted the radical change of our body from a natural to a spiritual, pneumatic state of which St. Paul speaks in the first letter to the Corinthians. However, they insisted that in this transformation, the resurrected body must remain somehow identical with our former body. Unfortunately, this concern for the continuity between the earthly and the resurrected body often led to a very, I call it, materialistic, physiological approach to the resurrection, with an attention to the physical identity of the body and the preservation of exactly the same bodily bits. The primary inquiry was, how will our bones and the countless particles dispersed among various elements be reassembled and to reform this identical body once again? From Augustine on, this, what I call materialistic interpretation of the resurrection, becomes dominant in the Western tradition, and even more so in the 13th century with scholasticism, because of the physics of Aristotle that could then be used to strengthen the argument about the body and what kind of body it was. On the medieval discussion, there is I have it on the handout, there is an excellent book, if you're interested in the topic, by Caroline Walker Byman. If ever you're interested in the discussion we have today, I can really recommend it. Now, in the last book of the City of God, which is devoted to eschatology, Augustine raises questions about the form, the size, the age of resurrected bodies. What about the bodies of those who die in infancy or at old age? What about fat people or thin people or handicapped people? Do not worry. As an omnipotent artist, God can reshape our bodies into a perfect, pleasing appearance corresponding to the ideal of beauty that is, as Augustine reformulates it, a harmony of parts together with a certain attractiveness of complexion. So, that's what we may expect. You may have been too fat or too thin, no problem. God can, by using the old bodily material, redistribute the parts, adding or discarding from it. Our new, transparent, shining, versatile, fast bodies will have all their original limbs, hair and nails, and even if we do not need some of them anymore, like the organs of digestion or of sexual procreation. They are, however, essential to our integrity and beauty. We shall all rise, the very young and the old, in the same age, wherein we realize the full perfection of our human existence. That is, I don't know if you are at that age. What's the age of the full perfection of human existence? That's 33. That's the age. Imitating Christ in his resurrection. And there is a text of St. Paul, you have it in the handout as the first text. That text was always read in that sense. Until we all come to the unity in faith, into a perfect man, into the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. Mensuram aetatis plenitudinis Christi. That was a text they all thought, okay, here there is a hint at what that perfect body, what age we will be at the resurrection. We moderns tend to be entertained reading, I am, reading those pages of Augustine, or laugh about some arguments. Our friend Erigena, John Scotus of Ireland, however, could not. He was deeply scandalized by those pages and similar ones in St. Jerome. I quote, I think you have it on the handout, that text. Yeah. They do not hesitate to declare that the bodies of the saints have spatial extension and retain the same stature and the same number of parts as was theirs previously, and are distinguished by their male or female sex, only admitting that they are changed into a spiritable body existence. If, however, our eternal happiness will consist in seeing and enjoying God, why is such a crude materialistic explanation of the eternal life of the resurrection needed? Yeah, in case of the damned, one might justify cruelly the need for a real body so that they could be put in the fire of hell. But this argument will not work for the blessed enjoying God's contemplation. The second quote, Erigena, always from his masterpiece, Periphysion. When I read of such things in the books of the Holy Fathers, I stagger, so to speak, amazed and horror-struck. Then I begin to ask myself how these most spiritually minded people could have defended such teachings in their writings and handed them down to posterity. That's about Augustine. And of course, John knows how risky it is in his milieu to criticize the great authority of Augustine. So he prepares his attack indirectly, announcing it from afar, but keeping out of polemics until he comes to the end of the 5th book of the Periphysion. There finally follows a full-blown criticism wherein he uses all his dialectical strategies, rhetorical techniques, and hermeneutical skills to counter Augustine, bringing against him other authorities who have more lofty views. The only way to save the authority of Augustine is to admit that he, like the authors of the biblical books, out of condescendence for their simple-minded readers, had to explain what our eternal destination will be in down-to-earth images. I quote, "The only reason I can conceive that they were induced to imagine and set down such things is that they might encourage at least those who were devoted to such earthly and carnal speculations and had only been nourished on the rudiments of faith to ascend to the contemplation of spiritual things. If they were to be told that there was to be no place, no time, no bodily substance at the end of this world, they would at once burst out with the indignant objection, then, in that case, there will be nothing at all if nothing of this kind is to remain. And they would turn away in scorn from those who only promise spiritual things. That's not real. I want real things. Because the great fathers took into account the simple faithful, they thought it better to teach that our sensible bodies would not pass away, but be transformed into heavenly and spiritual bodies. Thus the simple minds, who tend to interpret everything in a carnal manner, could accept that they have an ultimate destination in another state of life after death. Okay, that's a strategy of Augustine and other authorities. Erigena, however, does not feel constrained by the possible misunderstandings of the faithful. His discussion about the meaning of the resurrections is not supposed to be for the great public, but for disciples and friends around the palace school in law, capable of using their intelligence. He will defend a radical spiritualistic understanding of the resurrection, making it the test case, so to speak, of his views on the general return of the whole creature to God. In fact, the resurrection of the human body is, as he understands it, a privileged case of the general return of all things to their Creator. So let me first say something about how he understands the general return of all things. You have a text again on the handout from Erigena. Whoever attempts to understand by reason the nature of all things must not only explain how they proceed from the uncreated divine nature through division and multiplication from the most universal species to the individuals, but also bring back this multiplicity through analysis. Analysis is bringing up to the more simple, through analysis by the same stages through which the division had previously ramified into multiplicity, until it arrives at the one which remains imperceptibly in itself and from which that division started. Wow, that's a long text about division and bringing back to unity. And that's in fact, if you go back in the tradition to Plato, in the Phaedrus, when Plato talks about dialectic, there's the two movements of dialectic, from genus, bringing to species and to individuals, and then bringing it back and grasping everything under one genus. That's the task of dialectical understanding of nature, to grasp the division of nature and its recollection into unity, that is, to consider nature both in its procession from and its return to the uncreated divine nature, which is its origin and end. And here I have to say something about that masterpiece, the Periphysion. I'm quoting, all the texts come from the Periphysion, or on the division of nature. What's that work? What's the main topic of that work? It begins in the first page. Nature, where we can talk about nature in different ways. The first division of nature, we use the most fundamental distinctions, and was the distinction to be created or not created, to be creating or not creating. And if I combine that distinction with nature, then I have four natures, so to say. It's on your handout, the four natures. You may know it from classes on medieval philosophy. The first nature, what's that? That's the not created, but creating nature. That's the divinity, the origin of everything that exists. That's the origin of all nature. It's the not created, creating nature. From that nature comes a nature that's created and itself creating. That's a bit more complicated. That's the Platonic heritage in John Scotus Eriugena. You could say those are the Platonic ideas, or that's the universal causes, or the species and genus and the species of all things. And they come forth from the first divine creator, but they themselves have the possibility of creating the lower level. The lower level, or the third level, that's a level where the creation comes to an end. That's the level of what's created and what's no longer capable of creating, and that's the level of the sensible world and all the individual things, the world of generation and corruption we belong to. That's the third. Okay, that's the lowest level of the procession of everything. Well, but that procession of everything, and then we have the return, from the lowest to return, as in dialectic, the division. But in dialectic, you could say it's just logical, but here it's not logical, it's a structure or the metaphysical structure of reality itself. Everything proceeds from that divine nature until we reach the nature that's created and no longer capable of creating. And then begins the return. That lowest nature will return to its causes, to the second nature, and ultimately to the end itself. And the end is the same as the origin. God is the beginning and the end of everything. But wait, at the end, God is called the nature that's not created, of course, because it's God, but also not creating anymore, because the end of time, of the end of the universe, is where the world is no longer created. It's the world returning to God. Well, if I'm a Neoplatonic philosopher, my good friend Proclus, I know quite well from my research, well, you will say this is something we find in Neoplatonism, this idea of the, what you could say, the circle of beings. All, I quote Proclus, all that proceeds from something returns by nature to that from which it derived its existence. Now, but in Proclus, this cyclical process has no temporal meaning. It's in all eternity. Everything comes from the one and returns to it. That's the structure of reality itself. Now, and there is no time in that process of beginning or end. It's an eternal process. When, however, Christian thinkers adopted Neoplatonic metaphysics, they tended to interpret the cyclical process in a temporal sense. Thus, Erigena understands the procession of all things as the creation of the world, which sets the beginning of time. And in his view, the return is not just a metaphysical reversion of all things to their origin, but an eschatological process, which will happen at the end of times and lead to the suppression of space and time and to the ceasing to be of the whole sensible universe. So at the end of time, there will be no time anymore and no space anymore, and therefore no sensible world anymore. Will there be nothing? Well, there will be the divine nature that's not created, but the divine nature considered as not creating, but as the return, the finality of everything, where everything comes to an end. Well, that's what we have seen. That's the most fundamental division of nature. Well, and now what has this to do with resurrection? Well, because although in biblical language the term resurrection is reserved for the special mode of returning to God of human beings, we must realize, Erigena says, that the resurrection of the human body is only a specific case of the general resurrection, that is, the return of all things to their cause. The resurrection of human bodies is not an isolated event in the eschatology. It's the starting point of the general resurrection of the whole sensible universe. It's only within the context of the general resurrection that we may understand what is meant by resurrection of the human body in a specific sense. Okay. Well, to make it a little bit more complicated, well, it's not, but you have it on the handout. Erigena distinguishes 5 steps in the return of human nature to its cause. You have it in the handout. The first step is when the body is dissolved at death and called back into the 4 elements of the sensible world. The second is the resurrection, when each human being will receive his body reconstituted out of the common fund of the 4 elements. The third is when this resurrected body will be changed into soul or intellect. The fourth, when the spiritualized human nature will return to the primordial causes. The fifth, when that nature, together with its causes, will be moved into God. Okay? I think you could more or less follow. Well, the first step is the process, in this process is the physical disintegration of the body, its death and decay. However, by an original turn in his argument, Eriugena interprets this corruption of the body, that's the ultimate ruin, the ultimate disaster, is at the same time the first stage in the return. Of course, one could also consider death as the lowest depth of human fall. It's for a human person not possible to sink deeper than the level of a decaying body bereft of reason, sense, and life. But exactly because this is the ultimate ruin, it could also be seen as the starting point where the return begins. Thus, Eriugena says, the physical death is not only a negative experience, the destruction of the body, or as a Christian you could say, a punishment for our original sin, it also has a positive contribution, which is more important. I quote a Latin phrase, plus utilitatis quam vindicte. So the death has more utility, it's strange to say that, than it is a kind of punishment of him. But because it liberates us from the corruptible, sensible life in the flesh with all its sufferings. So that's the first step. The first step is, in the return, is death. Yeah? You have to go through death. There is no other return than through death. The second step in this ascent corresponds to what's traditionally understood as resurrection. This stage consists in recalling the body from the four elements in which it had been dispersed at death, and returning it to its soul so that it could form with the soul a new composition, but now an incorruptible and spiritual one. Erigena observes that there is no divergence in the Christian tradition in accepting the first two stages, the dissolution of the body and the reconstitution of it at the moment of resurrection. But concerning the three other stages, the transition of the resurrected body into soul and of the soul into its causes and ultimately of all into God, their opinions differ greatly. And most authorities reject the transmutation of the body into soul and into God. However, Erigena's position is not that the body becomes soul, but rather that's transformed into soul, that the body passes to a higher mode of existence. As he says, the substance of the body will pass into the soul, not so that it shall perish, but so that it shall be preserved in the better essence. So it's coming up to a higher level, and as coming up even higher from the soul to its causes, that's not an annihilation. It's becoming preserved in a better essence. And the same is true about everything being transformed into God. And Erigena comes up with his favorite examples. Iron, when melted in the fire, seems to be converted to fire. You think it's all fire. So it appears to be pure fire, yet the substance of the metal is preserved. So that's his favorite example of how everything will become God and at the same time be God, and the same, you could still say it's, if you need an orthodox argument. So the air seems to become entirely light when illuminated, and yet it remains as air distinguished from the light. So all these arguments clearly show that for Erigena, the supreme stage of the resurrection is the transitus. He uses a lot of times the term transitus, and transitus is the term, by the way, even in the Latin liturgy, in the old tradition of liturgy, for the moment of death is considered to be transitus. The commemoration in the calendar of the death of a person, particularly of a saint, is called the transitus. So, but Erigena uses transitus for the whole of creation that will pass and come to that other stage and return to God. Okay. After these more sublime speculations about the ultimate return of the whole creation, which can be called resurrection in a general sense. I now come in the second part of my talk to what is in the more proper sense resurrection. When each human person receives its own body from the common store of the four elements in which it had been dissolved at death. As I've noticed, the main issue in the patristic discussion about the resurrection had always been the question of the identity of the resurrected body with the earthly flesh. How is it possible to reintegrate into the resurrected body elements that belonged originally to our earthly body, but had been dissolved at death, and be reused 100 times since then in the process of generation and corruption? Gregory of Nyssa, a church father of the 4th century, raised this question in a celebrated treatise, a very famous, very much read in the Middle Ages, on the creation of man. And Erigena made a Latin translation of this Greek text. By the way, that's also exceptional in the 9th century to have somebody knowing Greek and translating Greek into Latin, and Erigena made translations of Dionysius, Maximus Confessor, and of this treatise of Gregory of Nyssa. Now, in chapter 27 of that treatise, Gregory raises the question of how it will be possible for the human body, which after death is wholly disintegrated and dissolved into the elements of the universe, to be restored at the resurrection. I quote, "How could the soul recognize in the common fund of the elements, water, earth, fire, air, those particles that originally belonged to this unique body?" As Gregory observes, there are some analogies in human life that may help us to understand how it's possible to recognize in a common group what belongs to each individually. I like the example. It's the example of the shepherds who have in summer a common herd of sheep pasturing in the mountains. All the sheep are there together. It's common. You could not say there, that's from A, from B, from C. No, it's common. It's common all the summer. And yet, at the end of the summer, this herd can be divided again among its respective owners, because the animals are accustomed to each of them and keep that relation, that's very special relation, and are accustomed to their proper homes. Moreover, there may be property marks put upon them referring to their owner. How could this example help us to clarify the problem of the resurrection of our body? Well, in our case, though the elements of our body will have been mixed together with all other elements at death, our soul will at the moment of resurrection recognize its own. Why? How could those particles be its own? For during our earthly life, all the element particles constituting our body have been marked in a way. And our soul will keep after death a seal, a sort of signet ring of these marks, which makes it possible to retrace the elements that correspond to it. Let me explain the nature of this seal or imprint in the soul. When the soul is connected to the body, it's no stranger residing in it. It's inclined to its body with affection. It has a relation with its body. It becomes really, it's my body. It's what makes me a unique person is my very special relation to the body. To that particular body with all its, I won't describe what all the particulars of your and my body may be. So, and my soul, each one's soul is in this cohabitation. It's a nice expression used. In this cohabitation, the soul acquires, without noticing it, some recognition of its association with this particular body, and will keep this relationship to this individual body even after death. So this imprint corresponds to the specific form, the eidos, that characterizes uniquely each human body. Now, Gregory distinguished this eidos from the material substratum of the body and its changing appearances. As we know, our body undergoes during our life, from birth to death, a continuous process of change. No particle in my body, no flesh, no blood, no bone remains ever the same. When I reach the end of my life, all elements of my body will have been replaced by new ones. Fortunately. So that's life. It's continuous change. So in a way, there is nothing the same. Is it true? Is there nothing the same? Yet, yes, it's the same. I can still say it's the same body, although everything in it has been changed. And although at the beginning I was a little child, a baby, a child, adolescent, adult, old, we can be deformed by sickness, recover our health. Nevertheless, people will still recognize us after many years. Sometimes with difficulty, yet I am the same. Not just the same. Yeah, that's the question. What makes my identity and all the changes of my life? I could say the identity is my soul, my subject, my consciousness, whatever. Big philosophical issue, what makes the identity of a person through. Okay, but you could also talk about the identity of your body. And that's what we're interested in. And that identity of the body is that what makes the body, in all the changes, the same body is what Gregory calls the eidos of the body. And that eidos of the body is what my soul recognizes. That's the imprint I have is of that eidos. Not of all the little differences, but of the eidos. They have a quote, I think, in the handout. For our being does not consist altogether in flux and change. If it had not from nature some stability, we could not grasp it. Some parts in us remain stable while the rest goes through a process of alteration. For the body is altered by way of growth and diminution, changing like garments, a biblical quote, the vesture of its successive states, while the eidos form remains itself unaltered through every change, not varying from the marks once imposed upon it by nature, but appearing with its own tokens of identity in all the changes it undergoes. It's this stable and unalterated form of the compound body that is permanently connected to the rational soul and will remain attached to it after death, not the ever-changing states of its material elements, which explain to their different mixture the color of my skin, the curling of my hair, the shape of my belly, the presence of wrinkles, of pimples, etc. So what the eidos is not all those accidental details of my appearance, but as I said, that what remains, the substantial form that remains. Of course, there is an adaptation of Aristotelian vocabulary here to explain that in all the varieties of there is an eidos that remains the same. Nevertheless, Gregory believes that the varying and fluctuating particles of the elements are marked by a permanent eidos and will keep that mark to which they once belonged. So at the resurrection, the soul, which still keeps the imprint of the bodily form, will not fail to recognize all the elements that originally were stamped by this form and recall them back and transform them into incorruptibility. Wow. Yeah. Although admiring the intelligent solution proposed by Gregory, I wonder whether it really helps. In fact, with this explanation, all the problems in the earlier debate on the identity of the resurrected body come back. For what if the original elements of an individual body have become, after its death, elements of another body? Some person may have been devoured by an animal, and that animal may have been killed and eaten again, etc., etc. Must we accept that and all those individuals put their own original mark on these elements, and if an element can be sealed with 2 or 3 marks, to whom will it belong after resurrection? Okay, my questions are silly, but the proposed answer is in a way also not satisfactory. Okay. So, Erigena now, but that was Gregory. He translated with a lot of difficulties, this text of Gregory, and he integrated large quotations in his own work. Oh, I forgot to say his work. The title of Erigena's work is Periphysion. He's very proud. He gave it a Greek title, Periphysion, about the natures. Well, and in the Periphysion there are large quotes from Gregory. Now, and he gives an enthusiastic commentary. But of course, it will be a twisted interpretation, as you will see. Now, what he values is Gregory's distinction between the permanent, identical form of the body and the ever-changing sensible states. However, Erigena connects this distinction to another distinction he found in Gregory. What that distinction? The dual creation of a human being. That's, you will say, you will be entertained, you will find it comic or entertaining, very interesting view. What's that double creation, that dual creation? Well, in a way, this has to do with a problem if you're reading the beginning of Genesis, book Genesis. You know, in biblical scholars, I don't know if there are theologians here in the group, will know that there are in fact two stories about the creation of man. There is the first story, the solemn text about the 7 days of creation and the creation of man the 6 days as the image of God. But there is then that other story of God creating Adam from the mud of the earth, etc. So there's a second story. And it's quite different. The first story is talking about man being created as the image of God. And in the second story, it's about man being created not as the image of God, but from the mud, the rainy ground of the earth, make like a pottery being made. So we have two biblical stories about the creation of man. Well, what's that? Well, according to Gregory, God's original plan, humans were intended to be similar to God, and in a way to be similar to angels. There would be angelic beings. There would be, not suffering as we are now from old age and arthritis and things like that. I don't know what you have at a young age, but okay, not suffering. No, not the mud, but the angelic human being. That was the first idea of God of creating us. Not without the need, don't be scandalized, without the need for sexual reproduction, which likens humans to irrational beasts. So that was the original plan. But God, foreseeing that humans would misuse their freedom and sin, that would be resulting in a fall from their angelic equality to bestial level, modified his initial plan. Consequently, he incorporated the consequences of sin into human creation even before sin occurred. In this respect, God is akin to a masterful engineer who anticipates potential problems. If he makes something, designs something, you also have to in a way to anticipate that it could be a problem with it. And then he incorporates solutions within the system in advance. So in this way, human beings have been created so that that first plan, intention remains, the ideal human beings, but because of, it's a very strange reasoning, that kind of foreseeing that human beings would abuse their freedom, there was a remedy and a kind also of penance and a remedy of that sin built in advance. So we have a double creation of a twofold creation. The sexualized animal body involving pains and passions, sickness and corruptions and dying at the end was created together with its original rational nature, though remaining external to this true essence. It's a kind of super adjectum added, as it were, as a remedy and a penance for sin. Okay, I won't continue about this double creation, but the interesting thing is that Erigena uses this double creation now to say something about the distinction between the permanent figure of the body and its changing appearances. So, I will explain with some other examples what's that superadded earthly corruptible body. What pertains to that body? Oh, the fact that we are sexual beings. Oh, there's a very contemporary discussion about gender, because Erigena says, it's a very famous quote, I once had to talk about that, homo est melior quam sexus. Human is better than sexus. One sexus, what sexus? You know what the term sexus comes from in Latin? It's cutting, it's dividing, it's secare. Secare, sexus comes from secare. So the fact that human being is not just human, but man or woman. So the fact that man is divided to male and female, a propagation by a mode similar to that of the beasts, the need for food and drink, the increase and decrease of the body, the alternation of sleeping and waking and its ineffable necessity, the innumerable differences between the individual bodies, etc., etc. So that's all the earthly corruptible body. The natural body, however, remains unchangeable, incorruptible through all those changes and variation, and never loses the bloom of its beauty nor the integrity of its essence, though it has been enabled to acquire all those corruptible qualities. Although we have to distinguish the natural and the earthly body, they are not two different bodies. In fact, there is only one body at this moment. The earthly, fleshy, corruptible body is not a true body. It's the mutable garment of a true and natural body. According to Erigena, it's this natural form of the body that will appear again in its full glory at the resurrection, when all the sensible garments have been deposed. We will then be in the spiritual state which God had originally foreseen for humans. Erigena expresses his views on the resurrected body in a great rhetorical text. You have it in the handout. What will be the resurrected body? Oh, not this corruptible body, which is the result of sin, but that which man had before the fall. Not this composite and dissoluble body, but that simple and indivisible body. Not this animal and earthly body, but that which is spiritual and heavenly. Not this body begotten by both sexes from seeds through carnal intercourse, but that which was brought forth before the transgression from the simplicity of nature. Not this body which is known to the corporeal senses, but that which is still hidden in the secret place of nature. Not that which was superadded in recompense for sin, but that which was inherent in the still incorrupted nature, and into which this corruptible and mortal body will return. One should notice that this resurrected body is not only sexually neutral, but also has none of the individualized features which makes it my or your body. In fact, the innumerable, indifferable differences, the color of our eyes, the skin, shape, the nose, are accidental to the permanent natural form of the body. They derive from matter and the qualities of the corruptible seeds out of which the sensible things originate, and are not included in what he calls the ratio, or the reason principle of the human body as conceived in the primordial creation. And now comes an even more radical view. This ideal body is in fact one and the same common form in all human bodies, and it remains unchangeable in them, whatever individual differentiation they may now undergo. Well, that's very. Although Erigena presents his views on the resurrected body as nothing but a paraphrase of Gregory, he radically modifies the original purpose of Gregory's argument. He follows the Greek theologian in distinguishing between the permanent form of our body and its ever-changing states. For Gregory, however, this permanent form is not a sexless, neutral body, but keeps distinctive individual characters that makes it possible to identify coming in paradise, to seize somebody, Lazarus, with Abraham, as the biblical story has. I would recognize somebody as Lazarus. The problem Gregory tried to solve, how can a soul recover at the resurrection all its dispersively bodily elements, completely disappears in John Eriugena's speculative approach. His interest is no longer the preservation of bodily parts in the new resurrected body. In his view, there will be no bodily parts anymore. They will return to what he calls, very strange, ratio corporis, the reason, the essence of the body. We will return, each of us will return to the essence of a human body. We will become an essential human body. Just as we are all human nature, we are all individuals, we have the same human nature. You could say, what does that mean, same human nature? Like we have the same human nature, we will have, when returning, we will return to the same, a common human body. What's that, a common body? What's that ideal body? As we have seen, it's a body without sexes, without physical masses occupying space and time, without individual differences. It's a body that's identical and common to all human beings. Not a Chinese or African or European body, not a male or a female body, not a handicapped or an athletic body, but just what it means to be a body when we strip off all the contingent conditions and endless individual differences that are just due to the genetic conditions and physical circumstances of offspring and upbringing. We could call it a political correct human body, in a way, if you like that expression. That's not in Erigena, but we could call it a political correct human body, which is one and common and ideally correspond to the one common human nature we all share. But may such a body which has no flesh, no sexual or vegetative or sensitive organs, which cannot be seen or touched, which occupies no place, no time, still be called a body? Is such a spiritual body not entirely transformed into spirit? Erigena emphatically affirms that it is a body and must remain a body even when it has returned into spirit. In fact, body belongs to the definition of human nature. Human beings are animals. Well, you could say because of sin. No, they are animals because of nature. To be sure, the animal character has been modified in consequence of sin, as I've said. But the reason principle of this body, that what it means to be a body, its eternal substance, its true nature, remains identical. Yeah, you could ask the same question again and again. What's that common body? Does a common body exist? What could be the status of a human? But the same about, as I said, about human nature. What's that common nature? So we shall all return to the unity of human nature we have never lost. And we shall be altogether one human nature. We does not preclude us from being distinct without confusion as persons. How we still be distinct? For this common nature remains capable of receiving different qualitative states. Some individuals will be granted theophany and eternal blessedness. Others will be eternally tormented in their consciousness. However, Erigena observes that those differences, radically divergent though they may be in the experience of the individuals, can no longer undermine or alter the perfect unity of human nature once it has returned to its creator. In the restored state of human nature, the resurrected body will be fully spiritualized and will no longer have individual qualities. Whereas a long tradition in theology, and in particular in iconography, likes to describe the different states of the blessed and the damned. You see on pictures, medieval pictures, the damned, how they are suffering, and then the blessed, how they are. Well, for Erigena, after the resurrection, they will all, the damned as much as the blessed, will have the same glorious body. We will all share the same body. But what will be different and what remains different is the fact that there are gradations of beatitude is related to the different, there will be gradations in beatitude corresponding to the moral qualities of what people have done in life. So the human beings will be discernible as individuals, not because they occupy different places in different times, have larger or smaller or more beautiful or less beautiful bodies, but because of the moral qualities they have acquired in their life. Okay, I think I have to come to an end with this. So, Eriugena, as I've said, makes a very clear distinction between the resurrection, which is common and the natural destination of the whole human race, and even of the whole creation returning to God, and what he calls the beatification and the deification, which is only granted to the blessed and elected humans. Deification is an absolutely gracious gift, different according to the merits of the individuals, whereas resurrection is a gift that's implied in the creation of human nature and occurs, as it were, very strict, very strong words, naturali lege cogente. It's almost forced by the law of nature, that there is a resurrection is a natural process. It's that we are beatified or that we are enjoying the vision of God. It's not naturally lege, that's grace. Whether we like it or not, collaborated with it or not, all of us will resurrect at the end of time, the good and the evil, believers and not believers, for the return is implied in the natural process of exitus and reditus. But thanks to God's grace that and our free will, that some are blessed and granted theophany and others not. It's by this doctrine of grace that it's possible for Eriugena, in all his Platonic speculations about the return of all things, to keep the individual diversity of human persons. Well, that's what I had to say about Erigena. Well, in very few time limits. And you could say, what a strange view. Well, for me, coming back to Erigena was in a way a pleasure to come back to Erigena. Well, if you do, suppose we are here, we have time, we have Thomas Aquinas class, and we read the text on the resurrected body. Well, then you will have an Aristotelian inspired physics of the natural body. Okay, I'll spare you and I have no time to go into the... So it's, in a way, a pleasure after having read the dull scholastic questions on the nature of the resurrection, from Augustine to, if I may say, and to the Catholic Catechism of the 20th century. I read, that's not something you read easily, but I read a section on resurrection. Well, it's a collection of biblical texts together, but it remains, but maybe you cannot do more than that. Well, compared to the naturalistic realism of the scholastics, Eriugena's speculation on the meaning of resurrection are original, provocative, spiritual. I have, of course, very clear and very strong also negative or critical views, and you will share them, I think. My first concern is Eriugena's very negative evaluation of the sensible body, which permeates his whole work. To be sure, he fully accepts that the sensible world and all bodies therein are created by God himself and are therefore perfect and good. Nevertheless, they are in the very act of creation linked to sin as a consequence and penance of it. Moreover, though we admire his efforts to overcome the crude materialistic understanding of resurrection, it's difficult to follow him in this reduction of the body to that common idea of the body, common body, and to spirit. If this is the meaning of resurrection, the resurrected body is no longer a body at all. It just becomes an idea of the body, belonging to an ideal human nature. We have all this insistence on the commonness of humanity, the uniqueness of the human individual is lost. And in a way, Erigena comes close to the Neoplatonic philosophers Augustine opposed so fiercely in his On the City of God. Augustine's emphasis, strong emphasis, and in our views, crude emphasis on the reality and the physical integrity of the resurrected body, including all its organs, must be understood in opposition to the Platonic negative attitude of the body. Of course, nobody now, I guess, not even a very orthodox theologian, would take this still literally. Yet, in their concern for the preservation of the natural body, Augustine and the scholastics express something that we now call the psychosomatic unity and identity of the human person. And this is, after all, a major correction by Christian belief in resurrection of the Platonic philosophical doctrine of the immortality of the soul. As I have shown we have the example of Erigena, when trying to understand the resurrection, most Christian authors tend to give an explanation that is not different from the immortality of the soul. Yet, we should not forget that the immortality of the soul is not a biblical doctrine, and thus does not belong to the Christian creed. That's a dangerous phrase I'm now using because it is a famous, at the Renaissance there was a council of the Fifth Lateran Council where the views of philosopher Pomponazzi were condemned, and there is a decree where it said, how could you say that as a church? That the immortality of the soul is not only a theological doctrine, but can also be philosophically be proven. That's between brackets. Well, that's not my view. I don't think that the immortality of the soul is a Christian view. It's not biblical. It comes from reading Plato and the Platonists. And of course, the Christian intellectuals, when they had problems in explaining their faith to their neighbors who were pagan, and also intellectual pagans and informed by philosophy, you can understand why they tended to understand the resurrection in the sense of the immortality of the soul. But we should not forget that in Greek philosophy, the argument of the immortality of the soul was always linked to the belief in the reincarnation of the soul. In the Christian adaptation of this immortality, we find a major change. Once the individual soul has come into existence, it will in eternity never cease to exist. This is for Aristotle impossible. How could something begin to exist and go on existing forever? Something that begins to exist will also cease to exist at some time. There is a link between beginning to... What a strange idea of a being, a soul, individual souls, billions of millions, souls, all starting to exist and going on for eternity. What a strange idea. What is immortality of the soul? For the Platonists of antiquity, it would be weird, this idea of a beginning existence and ending up, never ending up, eternal. That there are always more and more eternal beings that are coming to existence. Okay, I'll leave it for that discussion. But anyway, so the idea we know from philosophy, when philosophers later tried to make sense of Christianity and Christian faith, the immortality of the soul, yes, that's a philosophical item. The resurrection of the body, that's difficult. There are very few, after the Middle Ages, very few philosophers who try to say something on the resurrection of the body. They all escape, and even as I told you, Erigena in a way is escaping the problem that he is reducing the body to the idea of the body to what's present in the soul. So, So in Christianity, with that major change, once the individual soul has come into existence, it will in all eternity never cease to exist. Yet it will be in an unnatural state and imperfect as long as it's not unified with the body. And that's this in Aquinas and all the scholastic authors who will read about that problem, how immortal souls waiting for the resurrection of their bodies. What a strange, weird doctrine. All those souls are waiting centuries and centuries and centuries. Because yes, that's the other problem. If we have problems with resurrection, it's linked with another problem that's even more difficult to understand, the eschatology. How many Christians really believe in the return and the coming back and the last days? And the question of resurrection is linked, essentially linked to that eschatology. So, as I said, the reason why resurrection disappeared as a philosophical problem, that's clear. The question of immortality remained, but in another sense, as I explained to you, not the sense Plato in the Phaedo is talking about it. There are some philosophers here, and you may know that for Kant, the immortality of the soul is a postulate of practical reason. If the categorical imperative is of such a kind that I'm supposed to live according to the categorical imperative, the postulate of the immortality of the soul is the necessity of the will's endless progress towards complete conformity with the moral imperative. I won't explain that here, but it's interesting that for Kant there is not a resurrection, but the immortality of the soul is a postulate of practical reason. It's quite different, immortality. If you had time, I could say something more about Hegel. Although Hegel is in a way also a philosopher who tries to understand in a philosophical way, because philosophy comes after religion. Philosophy is understanding religion, but on resurrection there's very few lines in Hegel. There is a lot on Christ as the resurrected God and that, but man and God, but not on human resurrection as our ultimate finality. And what's interesting is that Hegel, in a way, is also very critical of the idea of personal, individual, the immortality of the soul, of the individual immortality of the soul. Immortality is not, the desire for individual immortality is based on an exceeding self-understanding of the finite self-consciousness. It's in a way the finite individual taking himself very, very serious, very important, very absolute. But nobody of us is absolute. This idea of a personal, individual immortality is for Hegel an example of what he calls the untrue form of self-consciousness. It's in a way a selfish idea. It's not. In the religious imagination, this abstract self-consciousness takes the form of a belief in personal immortality. In contrast, Hegel emphasizes the immortality of, and now we hear something that, again, reminds us of Erigena, of the universal, thinking as the universal being on itself is the immortal. For Hegel, only the spirit is immortal and eternal in the true sense of the word. Okay, I will not, it's not time, I have not promised to talk about Hegel. I skip that. So I added these comments, and I could say much more about that, these comments on modern philosophy, because I thought I could not just play the medieval tune. However, even going through modern philosophy, as I told you, you remain frustrated. And as a philosopher, and as somebody who at some places will say, I'm a believer, but as a philosopher, it's very difficult it's frustrating. Maybe it's wrong trying to understand resurrection. After all, I said it's a concept recalcitrant to all reasoning. And if I may give among modern philosophers one very famous example, you may know him, Ludwig Wittgenstein. Ludwig Wittgenstein kept a diary in his life, just the famous notebooks on culture and civilization. And what's very remarkable, there are many notes on the problem of resurrection. He was struggling with that, with how to make sense of it. And then, so he confides to his diary his struggle with resurrection. But he understands it not simply as a matter of believing in something, another miracle or another, but as something that we have, in a way, it forces us to have a shift in the way the world is perceived. It's an alternative grammar in apprehending the world. I'm quoting now Wittgenstein. And in a way, because it's so recalcitrant, and there's a lot of also in contemporary theology about that, about this idea that in a way in a way, I'm saying again what I said. There's not something you can. All attempts to make a philosophical understanding of the concept of resurrection, I think, are problematic. But again, it remains an essential concept of Christian faith, and it's a central part, whereas the immortality of the soul is not. Whereas philosophers always tried to make sense of the immortality of the soul. Resurrection was a problem. What could, to end with two last comments. Yeah, you may say, maybe resurrection, one way, well, to make sense for myself, that we should not too much see it as something happening in the future, something promised. The resurrection, the eschatological view. Well, there is also, and you have it already in the biblical text, in St. Paul, for example, there is in a way that you are now resurrected. I quote in the letter to the Colossians, if you have been raised with Christ, you are raised. You are raised. It's not just at the end. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. So there is, I think that's my way of, in a way that's something already Hegel said, but Hegel said that with the idea of immortality, where he said, in the immortality of the soul, it need not be imagined that it only comes into reality later. It's present quality. So in a way, that's, maybe you find this too simple as a solution, the idea that to live as a resurrected person. And that's different from all the other speculation. And my second, and that's my last thought, when all words fail and all understanding, there may be other ways to express what cannot be said. So, and I like to end these reflections with a short fragment of music. That's it.